The lights inside the Vatican Secretariat of State went dark at exactly 11:47 p.m., not because of a power failure, because someone had pulled the plug. And what Pope Adrian VII had seen on those screens in the 7 seconds before they went black would set off the most explosive financial crisis in the modern history of the Church. It was a Thursday night, the kind when Rome's summer heat sits heavy on the city like a wool blanket, the kind of night when most of the Vatican sleeps. But not Adrian. Not tonight. 3 hours earlier, a brown envelope had arrived at his private study inside the Apostolic Palace. No return address, no seal. Just a single USB drive and a handwritten note in Italian that read, "They will never show you these numbers voluntarily." Adrian sat at his desk for a long time, turning the drive between his fingers. He could feel the weight of it. Not physically, it weighed almost nothing, but the weight of what it implied. Someone inside the Vatican, someone with access to financial systems that were supposed to be locked behind layers of bureaucratic secrecy, had decided to betray the institution. Not to the press, not to Italian prosecutors, to the Pope himself. That distinction mattered. Whoever sent this believed Adrian was the kind of man who would act on it. He didn't call his secretary. He didn't alert Vatican security. He plugged the drive into his personal laptop, the same one he'd carried since his years leading a religious order, a machine with no connection to the Vatican's internal network. What he saw made him close his eyes and press his palms flat against the wooden desk. Rows of numbers, hundreds of them. Account codes that matched no official Vatican ledger. Transfers routed through banks in Luxembourg, the Cayman Islands, and Singapore. Some dating back decades, some barely 3 weeks old. And the amounts were staggering. Not millions, hundreds of millions, moving in complex circles, leaving no trace on any report ever submitted to the Council for the Economy. Adrian scrolled slowly. Each page revealed another layer. Intermediary accounts, holding companies with Latin names, wire transfers time-stamped at 3 and 4 in the morning, the hours when oversight sleeps. He recognized none of the account numbers, but he recognized the pattern. He'd seen something like it years earlier, reviewing the finances of overseas missions, the pattern of money that doesn't want to be found. He picked up his phone and called exactly one person, Cardinal Matteo Ferretti, the newly appointed prefect of the Secretariat for the Economy. Ferretti was 61, from Milan, trained in both canon law and forensic accounting. Adrian had handpicked him 4 months earlier over the objections of several senior cardinals who wanted someone more experienced, which in Vatican terms usually meant more compliant. Ferretti arrived at the Apostolic Palace at 1:15 a.m., still tying his shoes when Adrian handed him the laptop. He scrolled in silence for nearly 10 minutes. His face changed 3 times. Confusion, recognition, then something close to dread. He looked up and said 3 words. "This is real." Adrian nodded. "I want every account opened, every transfer traced, and I want it done before I leave for the coast tomorrow morning." Ferretti stiffened. "Holy Father, that gives us less than 18 hours. Then you should start now." What neither of them knew was that someone had already been watching. Someone inside the Curia who had spent years making sure those accounts stayed invisible. And that person had just received a notification on a private encrypted phone. The drive had been accessed. The alert hadn't come from Vatican IT. It came from custom monitoring software installed on the drive itself. A trap. Adrian had walked straight into it. By 6 the next morning, Ferretti had assembled a team of 4, 2 forensic accountants from the newly restructured Financial Supervisory Authority, which Adrian had overhauled the day before, removing its entire leadership and installing a director who answered directly to him. 1 digital security specialist from the Vatican's own security corps, and Sister Lucia Del Vecchio, a 53-year-old nun who had spent 20 years in international banking before taking her vows. She was Ferretti's secret weapon. She could read a balance sheet the way a surgeon reads a scan, spotting blockages and irregularities others would miss entirely. They set up in a windowless conference room in the palace of the governorate. No phones allowed inside, no laptops connected to any Vatican network, just the drive, printed spreadsheets, and a whiteboard soon covered in red ink and arrows connecting names to numbers to dates. Sister Lucia was the first to spot it, a pattern buried deep in the transfer records. Money flowing from the Vatican's own financial institute into a holding company registered in Luxembourg, called Domus Petri Holdings. On paper, it looked like a legitimate real estate management firm. A website, listed directors, annual filings with the Luxembourg registry. Everything looked clean. But Sister Lucia recognized two of the directors' names. Both priests, both assigned to the Secretariat of State, both serving under Cardinal Aldo Brancaccio, the Secretary of State himself, the same man who, 6 weeks earlier, had stood beside Adrian at a press conference praising the Pope's commitment to financial transparency. Ferretti set down his pen. "Are you telling me the Secretary of State has a private investment vehicle running off Vatican bank funds?" Sister Lucia didn't blink. "I'm telling you that approximately 240 million euros have moved through this entity over the past 7 years, and none of it, not a single euro, appears in any filing submitted to the Council for the Economy." The room went silent. But what they discovered next made that number look small. Domus Petri wasn't alone. It connected to a web of at least 11 other shell companies across 4 jurisdictions: Luxembourg, the British Virgin Islands, Singapore, Liechtenstein, each linked through layered ownership structures back to the same bank. The money moved in a specific pattern, out of the bank into Domus Petri, from Domus Petri into the shell companies, from the shells into investment vehicles, and from those into real assets. Luxury real estate in London, Paris, and Geneva, private equity stakes, even a vineyard in Tuscany. And some of it, this was the part that made Ferretti's hands shake, had been redirected into personal accounts belonging to 3 sitting cardinals. Not operational funds, not discretionary diplomatic accounts, personal bank accounts in their own names. One had received 17 separate deposits over 4 years, totaling more than 12 million euros. Adrian received the preliminary report at 9 that morning in his chapel, during the same 30 minutes of silent prayer he kept every day. Ferretti waited at the door, holding a single sheet with the findings condensed to 12 lines. When Adrian finished, he took the paper, read it once, folded it, and placed it inside his breviary. "How many people know about this?" "6, including you and me." "Keep it that way for now." Adrian had a decision to make. He was scheduled to fly out the next morning for a long-planned pastoral visit centered on migrants and the moral duty of welcome. A visit he had deliberately chosen to spend not in celebration, but praying at a cemetery for those who had drowned crossing the sea. The symbolism mattered. The world was watching. Canceling would raise questions he wasn't ready to answer, but leaving Rome meant leaving the investigation at its most fragile stage. He chose to go, but not before giving Ferretti one instruction that would change everything. "Before I return, I want Cardinal Brancaccio in my office. Don't tell him why. Don't tell anyone why. Just make sure he's there." Ferretti hesitated. Summoning the Secretary of State without explanation was almost unheard of. Brancaccio was 74, a creature of the old Curia, a man who had served under multiple popes and navigated every internal power struggle of the past 4 decades. He knew where every secret was buried because he had buried most of them himself. Confronting him without airtight evidence was dangerous, not physically, politically. Brancaccio had allies everywhere, in Rome, in foreign capitals, but Adrian wasn't asking permission, he was giving an order. The next morning, as Adrian boarded the helicopter for the coast, 2 things happened simultaneously in Vatican City. The first was routine. The press office released the Pope's schedule for the day: an outdoor mass, a visit to a memorial, prayers at a migrant cemetery overlooking the sea. The second was anything but routine. Sister Lucia, working alone in the conference room while the others rested, found a 13th account, different from the others, unconnected to Domus Petri or any of the three cardinals. It was a numbered account at a private bank in Zurich that had received a single deposit of 97 million, dated 5 weeks before the start of a major criminal investigation into a disastrous property deal years earlier, one that had ended in scandal, trial, and the conviction of a cardinal whose name still made curial officials wince. The timing looked deliberate. Someone had been moving assets to safety before the auditors arrived. She called Ferretti. He didn't answer. His phone had been confiscated 30 minutes earlier by 2 members of Vatican security, acting on orders from someone he had never met. They hadn't arrested him. They hadn't accused him of anything. They had simply stopped him in a corridor, asked for his phone for a routine security check, and walked away. When he protested, one of them showed him a signed authorization. The signature was illegible. The letterhead was from the Secretariat of State. Meanwhile, on the coast, Adrian stood in a windswept cemetery overlooking the Mediterranean. The graves were marked with simple crosses, some with names, most without. Below him, the sea stretched blue and impossibly calm, as if nothing had ever happened in its depths. He prayed in silence, his white cassock moving in the hot wind, but his mind wasn't entirely on the dead beneath his feet. Part of him was calculating, running scenarios. He had studied mathematics before entering the priesthood. He understood systems. He understood how power structures protect themselves. And he understood that the next 48 hours would decide whether his papacy would be remembered for reform or for failure. What happened next unfolded faster than anyone expected. At 2:30 p.m., while Adrian was still on the coast, Ferretti was released. No explanation given. His phone was returned, but when he turned it on, he found 3 of his encrypted files had been remotely wiped. The backup drive, locked in the conference room safe, was gone. Sister Lucia was sitting in the hallway, pale, clutching her rosary so tightly her knuckles were white. "They came in while I was printing the Zurich documents," she whispered. 2 men in dark suits. No identification, no words. They took the drive and left a folder on the table. Inside was a photograph of my sister's house. My sister and her children were in the front yard. Ferretti felt something he hadn't felt in years. Cold, genuine fear. Not for himself, for the investigation, for the Pope, for Sister Lucia's family. Because whoever had sent those men wasn't just hiding money. They were protecting a system, one that had operated inside the Vatican for decades, across multiple papacies, with the quiet consent or willful ignorance of men who wore red. He called Adrian directly. The Pope answered on the second ring, stepping away from a group of local officials waiting to escort him to a memorial. Ferretti told him everything: the confiscated phone, the deleted files, the stolen drive, the photograph. A long pause. The sound of Mediterranean wind. "Is Sister Lucia safe?" Adrian asked quietly, with a stillness more frightening than any outburst. "She's with me. She's scared. Move her to my private floor. Post 2 Swiss guards outside her door. Guards I've personally approved. Call the commander and give him my authorization code. And the investigation? It continues without pause, without compromise. Another pause. I'm coming back tonight." Adrian landed back in Rome at 8:45 that evening. The official reason given to the press was fatigue and the summer heat. The real reason was that he understood, with absolute clarity, that the window for this investigation was closing by the hour. Every minute that passed gave the other side time to destroy evidence, coordinate stories, and build a wall of institutional silence that even a pope might not break through. By 10 that night, Adrian, Ferretti, Sister Lucia, and 2 of the original investigators were gathered in Adrian's private study, a small room lined floor to ceiling with books, a wooden crucifix above the desk, a photograph of his parents on the shelf. The air conditioning barely worked and the Roman heat pressed against the windows, but the atmosphere inside was electric. Sister Lucia presented what she'd managed to save before the drive was taken. 47 pages photographed on her personal phone, which had been in the pocket of her habit, not on the table, when the men entered. She'd learned during her years in finance that the most important records are the ones someone doesn't want you to see. The photographs showed something none of them had expected. The Zurich account wasn't just receiving money, it was distributing it. Monthly payments had gone out to 14 recipients across Europe and South America for over 5 years. Some were legitimate charities. Some were political lobbying firms. And 3 of the payments, steady, recurring, never missing a month, went to law firms that had been directly involved in suppressing clerical abuse investigations years earlier. Money from the church flowing through secret accounts into the hands of lawyers whose job had been to silence victims. Adrian stood, walked to the window, and looked out over the darkened square below. The basilica glowed gold against the night sky, its dome rising like a promise, or a lie, depending on what you knew about what happened behind its walls. "This isn't just corruption," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is a machine built to protect itself, fed by the institution it was supposed to serve." He turned back to the room, his eyes clear, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who had made a decision from which there would be no retreat. "Tomorrow morning, I want 3 things. First, a formal request to the Swiss financial authorities for full disclosure of the Zurich account. Second, I want the names of every cardinal, bishop, and monsignor connected to any of these entities on my desk by noon. And third—" He paused, and the room held its breath. "I want Cardinal Brancaccio summoned. Not invited, not requested, summoned to appear before me at 3 tomorrow, in this room. And this time, nobody interferes. Nobody confiscates anything. Nobody threatens anyone. Am I understood?" Ferretti wrote it all down. Sister Lucia blessed herself, but the night wasn't over. At 11:30, Adrian's private phone rang. The number was blocked. He answered anyway. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, unmistakably Italian. "Holy Father," it said, "you are making a grave mistake." Adrian said nothing. He listened. "These accounts exist for reasons you do not fully understand. They have always served the Church in ways that cannot be explained to journalists or prosecutors or even to well-meaning reformers." "Who is this?" A slight pause. "Someone who has protected this institution longer than you have been a priest. Someone who watched you arrive with your optimism and thought, perhaps this one will understand that some walls exist for a reason." "The wall I found wasn't built for protection," Adrian said. "It was built for concealment. There is no difference, not in this church, not in this city." The line went dead. Adrian didn't sleep. He sat alone in his private chapel until dawn, with the silence and the weight of what he'd uncovered. He thought about his predecessor, a reformer in his own right, who had tried fiercely to clean the Vatican's finances, stripping the Secretariat of its investment portfolio, creating oversight bodies, pushing through trials. And yet the system had survived, adapted, grown new limbs in new jurisdictions with new names, like a vine cut at the root that simply sprouts from a different wall. He thought about the voice on the phone. Its calm certainty, its patronizing tone, the assumption that a pope could be contained, that this outsider who prayed in a foreign accent and believed, apparently in earnest, that truth could set an institution free rather than destroy it, would eventually learn his place. By 7 the next morning, the formal request to Swiss authorities had been sent. By 9, the list of names was on Adrian's desk. 23 of them. Cardinals, archbishops, monsignori, some retired, some active, some working in offices less than 200 meters from where Adrian now sat reading their names. 3 had attended his installation. 1 had helped him vest that day. At 10, something unexpected happened. Cardinal Brancaccio didn't wait for his 3 o'clock summons. He appeared at the Apostolic Palace unannounced, flanked by 2 aides requesting an immediate audience. The guard at the entrance hesitated. Protocol required advance scheduling. Ferretti, crossing the hallway, made the call on the spot. "Let him in." Brancaccio entered Adrian's study with the posture of a man who believed he was still in charge. 74 years old, silver hair swept back, dark eyes that had faced down prime ministers and intelligence chiefs across negotiating tables. He sat in the leather chair opposite the desk without being invited, a small act of defiance. "We need to discuss what your people have been doing inside the governorate," Brancaccio said, using Adrian's given name, a deliberate act of condescension, stripping away the title to remind him who had been a prince of the church while Adrian was still teaching mathematics in a small town half a world away. Adrian didn't react. He didn't flinch, didn't correct him. He let the silence hold for 3 full seconds. A technique learned not in seminary but in mathematics, where the pause before revealing a proof is sometimes more powerful than the proof itself. Then he opened a folder and slid it across the desk. "These are the accounts your office has been hiding from the Council for the Economy," he said, his voice flat, almost conversational. "Domus Petri Holdings. 11 associated shell companies across 4 jurisdictions. 240 million euros in undisclosed transfers over 7 years. A numbered account in Zurich receiving and distributing funds to 14 entities, including 3 law firms directly involved in suppressing clerical abuse investigations." Brancaccio didn't look at the folder. He kept his eyes on Adrian. "Those accounts are operational instruments," he said slowly. "Every Secretary of State for half a century has maintained discretionary funds for sensitive diplomatic work that cannot pass through official channels. This is not corruption. This is how the Holy See has operated on the world stage." "Diplomatic work," Adrian repeated, "including monthly payments to firms whose sole documented purpose was preventing abuse survivors from testifying." For the first time in the meeting, Brancaccio's composure cracked. Not dramatically, not visibly to someone who didn't know what to look for, but Adrian saw it. A flicker in the eye, a slight shift of weight, the body language of a man realizing his opponent knows more than expected. "I don't know anything about those specific payments," Brancaccio said. "Then you won't object to a full investigation." "You are the Pope," Brancaccio said, steel now beneath the silk of his voice. "But you are not omniscient. You cannot unravel 60 years of institutional architecture because you found something on a USB drive that offends your sense of transparency. This church has survived 2,000 years. It has survived schisms, wars, plagues, and revolutions. It will not be saved by spreadsheets and forensic accountants." Adrian leaned forward, hands flat on the desk, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "It won't be saved by secrets either." The meeting lasted 47 minutes. When Brancaccio left, his aides noticed something they had never seen in all their years of service. His hands were trembling. By noon, the news had spread through the Curia like fire through dry grass. Not the details, those were still tightly held, but the signal was unmistakable. The Pope had summoned the Secretary of State. The Pope had confronted him directly. The Pope had not backed down. Cardinals began calling each other on private lines. Those on the list of 23 scrambled to understand how much Adrian knew, how much could still be hidden. But they were too late. At 1 o'clock, Ferretti executed the second phase of Adrian's plan, issuing formal preservation orders for all financial records held by the Bank, the Secretariat of State, and the office managing the Holy See's assets. Every digital file, every paper ledger, every archive box, every safe, sealed under the Pope's direct authority. Anyone who destroyed or concealed a record from that moment forward would face immediate canonical penalties. The head of the Vatican Bank received his order at 1:15. He read it twice, then called Brancaccio. No answer. He called again. Nothing. He walked personally to the Secretariat of State and found Brancaccio's office empty. The desk cleared, the computer wiped. The personal safe, built into the wall behind a painting, stood open and empty. He called Ferretti. "He's cleaned his office. Everything is gone." "Where is he?" Nobody knew. But Brancaccio hadn't left Vatican City. The Swiss guard confirmed he hadn't passed through any gate, and his car was still parked in its spot. He was inside the walls somewhere. They found him at 4:30 in the Vatican gardens, sitting alone on a stone bench near a quiet grotto tucked among ancient trees and manicured hedges. No aides, no phone, just an old man in a red-trimmed cassock, staring at a statue while the summer light filtered gold through the pines. Ferretti approached carefully, the way you approach someone at the edge of something. "Your Eminence, the Holy Father is asking for you." Brancaccio looked up. His eyes were red, not from tears. Men like him didn't cry. From exhaustion. From the accumulated weight of decades of carrying secrets that couldn't be shared, maintaining a machinery of silence that had, for 60 years, operated in the space between what the Church preached and what it practiced. And now that machinery was being dragged into the light by a man who believed, with apparently genuine conviction, that the truth could set an institution free rather than destroy it. "Tell him I'll come," Brancaccio said quietly, "but tell him this too. What is opened cannot be closed again, and not everyone who falls will deserve to." The second meeting happened at 6 that evening. This time, Brancaccio was a different man. The arrogance was gone, the condescension vanished, replaced by something harder to read. Resignation, perhaps, or a deeper kind of calculation. How much truth to offer in exchange for how much mercy. He confirmed the existence of Domus Petri. He confirmed the discretionary accounts. He offered context for some of the transfers, back channels to secure the release of hostages in conflict zones, payments to informants in countries where Christians faced persecution, funding for communities operating under regimes that had outlawed the Church. Some of it sounded legitimate. Some of it lived in the gray space where institutional survival meets moral compromise, and some of it, he admitted, he couldn't explain. "There were others before me," Brancaccio said. "I inherited a system. I maintained it because I believed it served a purpose. I did not create it." "Who did?" Adrian asked. Brancaccio was silent for a long time. The clock ticked. Shadows shifted across the floor as the sun moved behind the basilica. "If you follow the Zurich account far enough back," he finally said, "you will find names that will hurt this church more than anything I have done." "I'm not afraid of names," Adrian said. Brancaccio looked at him with something that might have been pity or admiration, or both. "You should be." Adrian dismissed him just after 7, instructing Ferretti to continue the investigation without restriction and without deference to rank or title. He authorized the financial authorities director to bring in external forensic auditors, a first in Vatican history. No internal accounting firm would touch this. The auditors would answer to the Pope alone. And he made one final decision that night, one that would send shockwaves through the Catholic world when it was announced. He ordered the preparation of a formal decree requiring every Vatican office, congregation, and council to submit complete, unredacted financial records within 60 days. No exceptions, no exemptions, no discretionary redactions. Every euro accounted for, every transfer documented, every account disclosed. The decree would be signed the following week. Its title, chosen by Adrian himself, left no room for ambiguity. Lux in Arcana. Light into secrets. The next morning, Adrian left for the papal summer residence. He appeared on the balcony overlooking the town square, blessed the residents gathered below, and settled into what the press office described as the beginning of his summer rest. But there was no rest. Not for Adrian, not for Ferretti, not for the 23 names on that list, not for the anonymous voice that had called in the night. Because behind the ancient walls, behind the fountains and gardens and centuries of accumulated tradition, the most thorough financial investigation in the Church's modern history was only beginning. In the days that followed, anonymous quotes from senior officials appeared in Italian newspapers expressing concern about destabilizing reforms driven by idealism rather than understanding. 3 cardinals requested emergency meetings with the Pope. All 3 were denied. A 4th submitted his resignation. Adrian accepted it within the hour. The Swiss banking authority confirmed receipt of the formal request and indicated it would respond within the standard window. But through quiet diplomatic channels, officials signaled that the scope of what the Vatican was asking them to open was far larger than anyone had anticipated. And Sister Lucia Del Vecchio, the former banker who had left a career in finance to serve God and who now found herself at the center of a war between money and faith, returned to the conference room in the governorate. This time, the room had a new reinforced lock, a permanent security detail posted outside, and a direct encrypted line to the Pope's private study. She opened her laptop, adjusted her glasses, took a slow breath, and began to trace the Zurich account backward, through years, through decades, through the silent, shadowed corridors of institutional power, where money moved without names and decisions were made without minutes, and men in red carried secrets no confession could absolve. What she would find in those records, the full devastating scope of what had been hidden, would take weeks to unravel completely. But the first thread had been pulled, and it was not going to stop. Pope Adrian XIV, the outsider, the reformer, the mathematician who had become a priest who had become a pope, had made one thing unmistakably clear to every cardinal, every monsignor, every bureaucrat and shadow broker who had ever profited from the darkness inside the Vatican's walls. This church would not hide any more. End. This story and all characters within it are entirely fictional and are not intended to depict any real person or real institution.